All right, let's dive into something pretty fundamental in Spanish today, irregular verbs.
That's right.
We're looking at a video from a language learning channel that has 50 irregular Spanish verbs. Now, you might be thinking irregular verbs, that sounds like a lot. But honestly, they're essential for really understanding and speaking Spanish well.
Yeah, they're the building blocks in a way.
And the video's entirely in Spanish, but don't worry, we're going to break it down and explain everything.
Absolutely.
So, irregular verbs are tricky because they don't follow the normal conjugation rules, right?
Yeah, they can be a little intimidating at first because you can't just apply the same ending to every verb in every tense.
Right.
But once you learn these patterns, they really become a lot less scary. And they're so important because they really let you express yourself more naturally and in a way that regular verbs just don't.
Yeah, it's kind of like meeting those friends who always have a different way of saying things, and once you get to know them, their quirks actually become part of their charm.
Exactly. It's like their own little signature.
Yeah.
And just like making friends, it takes a little effort to really get to know these verbs, but it's so worth it.
Okay, so let's get into some examples. Acostarse, to go to bed. And what's interesting is this one's also reflexive, right?
Reflexive verbs can be tricky, especially for new learners, because it's almost like the action is bouncing back on the subject.
So instead of saying like, I put to bed, it's more like, I put myself to bed.
Right, exactly. And this idea of reflexivity in Spanish is really fascinating. It goes beyond just the grammar. It's really woven into the culture.
Interesting.
There's this focus on the self and your own actions. And that is reflected in the language itself.
Wow. I never thought of it that way. It's like these verbs are hinting at deeper cultural values. And actually, the video creator mentioned that they're going to do a whole video later on just on reflexive verbs.
Oh, that's great.
So if you're really looking to level up your Spanish, that might be a good one to watch.
Yeah, definitely check that out.
So another one that stood out to me was an under, to walk. And we were talking earlier about how we also have the verb caminar, which also means to walk. But caminar is regular, so why do we even have two verbs that mean the same thing?
That is a really good question. And this actually highlights a really important point about irregular verbs, which is that they often have subtle shades of meaning that you might miss if you only focus on that basic definition.
Yeah.
So while both mean to walk, Ender has this slightly more informal feel, more colloquial. It can also kind of imply a sense of wandering or aimless movement, whereas caminar is more about purposeful walking.
Okay, so if I'm just strolling around, maybe I'd use an undar. And if I'm like power walking to a meeting, that would be caminar.
Exactly. It's all about context.
That's right.
And the specific nuance you're going for. And the fact that undar is irregular in the past tense really adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, I see. Okay, I'm starting to see how these aren't just random rule breakers. They're adding all this personality to the language. Okay, so carrier, it means to fall. This one's only irregular in the first person, singular, which seems like a little bit of a tease.
Right, it does.
Yeah.
But these little irregularities, they're actually really important.
Yeah.
Because they remind us that pronunciation in Spanish is really closely tied to the spelling.
Right.
And mastering these variations will make you sound more natural and more confident.
So it's not just about memorizing the conjugation, it's about how that conjugation impacts the sound of the language.
Okay, I'm ready for more. What else do we have?
Oh, we have a couple multitaskers. Contar, which means to count, but it can also mean to tell. And probar, which can mean to try or to taste.
Wait, so probar can mean to taste, but not to try on clothes.
Yeah, that's a good question.
How would you say try on in Spanish?
You would say probas. You add the reflexive pronoun to indicate that you're trying on the clothes yourself.
Okay.
So, yeah, contar and probar are great examples of how a single verb can have multiple meanings, depending on the context.
Okay, so they're like linguistic chameleons. They're adapting to their surroundings.
Right, exactly. I'm starting to see a pattern here. These irregular verbs aren't just about breaking the rules. They're about these layers of meaning. What else do we have that might surprise our listeners?
Let's talk about decir, which means to say, and queer, which means to want. Both of these undergo some pretty dramatic spelling changes when you conjugate them.
Right.
For instance, decir, because digo, dice is dice. It's like the word wants to be different.
I like that. It's like the verb is saying, I'm not just going to follow the crowd, I'm going to do my own thing.
Exactly.
I like that.
And queer does something similar. It's like the verb itself embodies this idea of wanting, this yearning for something different.
All right, before we move on, centaur and centarse. Those two always seem to trip people up. Because they both have to do with sitting, but one's reflexive and one's not. Can you break that down?
Yeah, of course. So this is where the importance of those reflexive pronouns really shines. So sentar means to sit someone down. So you're performing that action on someone else. But sentarse means to sit oneself down. So that little reflexive pronoun se makes all the difference.
Right.
And you mentioned earlier how these subtle differences in verbs can actually have cultural implications. Is there something about sentar and sentarse that relates to Spanish culture? Absolutely. In many Spanish-speaking cultures, offering someone a seat is a sign of respect, especially to elders or to guests. So using the correct verb, when offering someone a seat, it's not just about grammar. It's about showing courtesy, showing consideration.
That's really interesting. It's like these tiny grammatical details can really unlock a whole world of cultural understanding. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a lot more confident tackling these irregular verbs now that we're seeing the patterns and the purpose behind them.
Me too. And remember, this is just the beginning. We still have a lot more verbs to explore, each with their own unique personality and story to tell.
All right, can't wait.
Okay, let's keep going with these irregular verbs. We have dormir, which means to sleep.
Dormir. The verb that's probably on everyone's mind a little more often than they'd like to admit.
Yeah.
But it makes me think, do irregular verbs ever sleep? Or are they always up to their grammatical antics?
That's a funny way to think about it.
Yeah.
But it actually brings up an interesting point. While dormir has some irregular forms, it does follow a pretty common stem-changing pattern. So it's almost like it's getting a bit of rest compared to some of the more radically irregular verbs.
Okay, so even in irregularity, there are degrees of rebellion.
Right.
Makes sense. If every verb was wildly irregular, it would be impossible to learn.
Exactly. The brain craves patterns, even when it comes to things that seem random. And those patterns are what make language learning, even the tricky parts, manageable.
Okay, so dormir might be getting a little snooze, grammatically speaking. But what about encender, which means to turn on? Does that one have any surprises?
Well, encender is a stem-changing verb, so it does have some shifts in its forms, especially in the present tense. But it's actually a good example of how understanding those stem changes can unlock a whole group of verbs.
Oh, interesting.
Once you learn the pattern, it becomes so much easier to conjugate other verbs that follow that same rule.
It's like learning a master key that opens up a whole new set of doors.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
I'm starting to see how understanding these patterns is way more efficient than just trying to memorize each verb individually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, what else fits into this idea of patterns?
Well, let's look at encontrar, meaning to find, and intender, meaning to understand. Both of these start with the prefix and intender, and they both undergo stem changes in a similar way.
So if I recognize that prefix, I can kind of anticipate that there might be some stem changing action going on.
Exactly.
That's a good tip. I'll definitely be on the lookout for those prefixes now.
Yeah, they can be really helpful clues.
Okay, so the video creator mentioned that there's a verb on this list that doesn't even have a direct translation in English. That sounds intriguing.
And that's the verb haber.
Haber?
Yeah, haber is super important in Spanish, but there's not really a one-to-one equivalent. In English, it's often used to form compound tenses, like the present perfect, which is a way of expressing actions that started in the past, but have a connection to the present.
Okay, so instead of just saying, I ate, you would say something like, I have eaten, and that have would come from haber.
Exactly.
Interesting.
It's almost like haber is adding a layer of context, connecting the action to the present moment. This could seem confusing at first, but mastering haber is really essential for speaking fluent Spanish.
Okay, so haber is a real workhorse in Spanish.
Right.
Speaking of verbs that get a lot of action, what about have? To do or to make? I feel like I use that one all the time.
Yeah, haber is so versatile. It's one of those verbs that pops up in all kinds of situations. And it is irregular with some unique forms that you just have to kind of learn by heart.
Okay, so no shortcuts there. Just got to roll up my sleeves and memorize.
Well, memorization is part of it. But remember, it's also about understanding the context and how the verb is used in different situations. The more you practice, the more natural it will become.
Right. Okay, what other adventures in irregularity await?
Well, we have a couple of verbs that are super essential for any language learner. Ir, which means to go, and lir, meaning to read.
Ir. the verb that takes you places. And leer, the verb that expands your horizons. It's like they represent these fundamental aspects of language learning, exploration and immersion.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And both of them have irregular forms, especially in the present tense.
Right.
But don't let that discourage you. They're both high-frequency verbs. So the more you use them, the more natural those forms will become.
Okay, practice makes perfect.
Right.
What else?
We have el over, which means to reign, and mover, which means to move.
Lover. I'm definitely feeling a downpour of irregular verbs today. But, rain can be refreshing, just like learning a new language. And I like mover because it can be both literal and figurative. You can move a chair, but you can also move someone with your words.
Right, exactly. Language has this power to move us in really profound ways. And both of these verbs, elver and mover, are irregular, but they follow some fairly predictable patterns.
So even when it's raining irregular verbs, there's an umbrella of patterns to keep us dry.
I like that visual.
Yeah.
All right, what other verbs do we want to look at today? Let's talk about nacer, which means to be born, and negar, which means to deny.
Nacer. That one always makes me think of new beginnings, possibilities. And nager, well, I guess we can't deny that irregular verbs are part of life.
That's true.
And a big part of learning Spanish.
Right. It's all about embracing those challenges.
Yeah.
Both nacer and nager have irregular forms that you want to pay attention to.
Challenge accepted. What else do we have?
We have a few more that deal with our senses. Oír, which means to hear. Oler, meaning to smell. And sentir, meaning to feel.
Ooh, those are good ones. I can practically hear the Spanish guitar music, smell the paella, and feel the warmth of the Spanish sun.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's amazing how language can transport us like that. And these verbs, or, oiler, and sentir, even though they have their quirks, they're so worth mastering because they just open up so many possibilities for expression.
Yeah, I agree. So we have hearing, smelling, and feeling. What about tasting?
Yes, we already talked about probar. But there's also saber, which can mean to know a fact or to know how to do something. But it can also mean to taste.
Wow, so saber is a real multitasker.
Right.
It's like the Swiss Army knife of Spanish verbs.
Yeah.
I'll have to add that one to my list of verbs to practice.
It's a good one to have in your linguistic toolkit for sure.
Okay, what else?
We also have pedir, which means to ask for, and pensar, which means to think.
So I could use pedir to ask for a delicious plate of tapas, and then use pensar to contemplate the complexities of irregular verbs. While I enjoy every bite...
I like the way you think. And speaking of thinking, this might be a good time to address the two to-be verbs in Spanish, ser and estar.
Yes, the infamous ser and estar,
Right.
Always tripping people up. What's the key to keeping them straight?
Well, the simplest way to remember it is that ser is used for permanent or inherent qualities, while estar is used for temporary states or conditions.
Okay.
So you would use ser to say, I am tall, because your height is a permanent characteristic. But you would use estar to say, I am tired, because being tired is a temporary state.
Right. That's really helpful. I'm going to have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's a good distinction to remember.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, but I know there's still more verbs on the list.
Yes, there are.
What else is in store for our listener?
Okay, so we have a few more that deal with movement and location. Salir, which means to go out. Seguir, meaning to follow. And venir, which means to come.
Ooh, salir, seguir, venir. Sounds like a roadmap for navigating the Spanish language.
Right.
All irregular, of course.
Of course, making the journey a little more interesting.
Right, yeah.
And speaking of journeys, we also have perder, meaning to lose, and volver, meaning to come back or to return. It's almost like a reminder that even if you get lost in the labyrinth of irregular verbs, you can always find your way back.
I like that. It's reassuring to know that even when we make mistakes, we can always learn and grow.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of language learning.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of our list.
Yeah, we are.
What other gems are waiting to be uncovered?
Okay, we have soltar, meaning to release, and soñar, meaning to dream.
Soltar, soñar.
Perhaps our listener can release any lingering anxieties about irregular verbs and dream of speaking fluent Spanish.
I love that positive spin. It makes me think, are there any connections between irregular verbs and Spanish culture in general? We talked about how reflexivity might reflect this focus on the self, but do any other patterns merge?
That's a great question, and it's something that linguists have debated for years. Some argue that irregular verbs, because they often have deeper roots in the history of the language. Might reflect older ways of thinking or expressing oneself. Others suggest that the prevalence of irregular verbs in Spanish might contribute to its musicality and its expressiveness.
Wow, it's like these little verbs hold clues to a whole cultural tapestry.
Right.
I'll definitely be pondering that as I continue my Spanish journey.
It's fascinating to think about.
Okay, down to the last few verbs.
All right, we have tener, which means to have, traducir, meaning to translate, and traer, meaning to bring.
Okay, so I can tenor the confidence. To traducir Spanish texts and traer my newfound fluency to every conversation.
Exactly. And remember, fluency isn't about perfection. It's about embracing the journey and enjoying the process.
Very well said. Okay, I think we've covered all 50 verbs.
We did it.
I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty accomplished.
Yeah, me too. I hope our listener feels the same. And remember, these verbs may seem daunting at first, but with practice and a little bit of curiosity, you can definitely master them and unlock a whole new level of fluency.
And don't forget, the video creator that we've been talking about also have a ton of other resources for learning Spanish. So if you're looking to dive even deeper, be sure to check those out. It's amazing to think that we just explored 50 irregular Spanish verbs. It feels like we've been on a real linguistic adventure, uncovering all these hidden patterns and connections.
It really has been quite a journey. And remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. The Spanish language is full of these fascinating irregularities and nuances just waiting to be discovered.
Okay, before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to a couple of verbs we talked about earlier. We talked about preferir, which means to prefer, and how it has some irregular forms in the present tense.
Yeah, prefer is a great example of how even simple verbs can have those little quirks. It's a good reminder to always pay attention to those details, especially when you're conjugating in different tenses.
Right. And then there's queerer. To want. I'm definitely wanting to become more fluent in Spanish, and understanding these irregular verbs feels like a big step in the right direction.
It really is. And queer is a great verb to focus on because it's so versatile. You can use it to express desires, wishes, and even needs.
So it's like queerer is the fuel for our language learning journey.
I love that.
The desire that keeps us going.
Speaking of keeping things going, we have recordar, which means to remember.
Ah, yes.
A reminder to hold on to all those verb forms we learned.
Recordar. I need to recordar all these amazing insights about irregular verbs. Maybe I should write a song about them.
You should. Music is such a powerful tool for language learning. You can even include roer, to laugh. Laughter is always a good way to make learning more enjoyable.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you're not having fun, you're not doing it right.
Right.
Okay, so we got recordar, to remember, reír, to laugh. What other verbs do we need to make this Spanish learning fiesta complete?
We have repetir, which means to repeat. Repetition is key for really solidifying those irregular verb conjugations.
Right. Practice makes perfect.
Especially with those rule breakers.
Yeah.
And after you've repeated those verbs a few times,
Yeah.
maybe try to traduce or something. To translate.
Yeah.
To really test your skills.
Oh, yes. Translation. That's a great way to see how all the pieces of the language fit together. It's just so satisfying when you can actually understand and express yourself in another language.
It really is. It's like you're opening this door.
Yeah.
To a whole new world of communication.
Right. Okay, so we've covered so much today. We talked about patterns, exceptions, cultural insights, all related to these 50 irregular verbs. But what's one key takeaway you hope our listener will remember?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing is that irregular verbs, while they can be challenging, they're also incredibly rewarding to learn.
Yeah.
Add this depth and nuance. Even a little bit of poetry to the Spanish language. So embrace the challenge. Be patient with yourself. And most importantly, have fun with the process.
I love that. Couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you for joining us today on this deep dive into the world of irregular Spanish verbs.
It was my pleasure. And to our listener, I'll leave you with this final thought. As you continue your Spanish journey, pay attention to the verbs that feel particularly tricky or interesting. Don't just try to memorize the conjugations. Try to really understand the why behind them. Explore their origins, their nuances, their connections to culture. You might be surprised by what you discover.
That is a fantastic challenge. And remember, the more you explore, the more you'll fall in love with this language, the beauty and the complexity of Spanish. So thanks for joining us, and happy learning.